Hello and most
most
welcome
welcome
to
to
833. I'll
I'll
continue
continue
today
today
with
with
Francis
Francis
Wylin's
Wylin's
Wittgenstein
Wittgenstein
on
on
understanding
understanding
and emotion, grammar and methods. Last time we got a little first insight into the thesis in the article. To have a closer look at what is emotion. It was mentioned one other interpreters of Wittgenstein, black, and then quickly we went over to Joachim Schulte, someone who has turned up several times in the lecture series, a well-renowned interpreter of Wittgenstein. And so to speak, the problem begins with the idea that understanding is a process, something that is going on inside of the head. Often the culprit or the accused is the brain or the activities of the brain. And that leads, of course, to the Denetian or Daniel Dennett solution, that there being no consciousness at all, because it is an automated process of kinds. And of course, we also recognize this in Putnam's Brain in the Vat and many other examples of these paradoxes. Wittgenstein wants to show the way out of the fly bottle for the fly, and in this case we are the flies. And thinking as a process is a definite jail, I would say. You get incarcerated by that thinking, and since it's not following the grammatical rule, you get caught up and you cannot move on. And that, oddly enough, and listen now, that is a double take. It also applies to understanding Wittgenstein. So to speak, how do we understand him? If everything is a priori rule governed, everything needs to be understood at once and to be correct. Wittgenstein is showing it is more like arranging books in a library. Imagine they've been caught up in a sort of chaos. And slowly, little by little, more and more, grammatical order, if you like, will be established in the library. Not everything by once. It was also mentioned 3 types of grammatical rules. And I think that is actually a thing to be remembered. It should be carved in stone, almost. The first type is ostensive definition, the starting point of philosophical investigations and understanding not only by Augustine but many others. In fact, it is most uncommon, and it's connected to the words this and that, for instance. They are truly ostensive. It's not so hard to fathom how that could lead to an idea of the whole language system to be representative. So my words are pointing to some otherworldly reality. So the words are like the long finger pointing out, sign and signified. I think you can see that. The second type of grammatical rule is that there is a sort of explanation for the word. He puts the most common example in logic: an unmarried man is a bachelor. And I'd say that is a very common view today, or an underlying mistaken perception of reality. But it is still true in some cases. It's as ostensive is true when it comes to this and that. There are certain cases where this is absolutely apt. The third type of grammatical rule is much, much more common. It specifies the circumstances under which a word is used. That is circumstantial. It is dependent on you as an observer. You can see we can make connections here to how reality works in a quantum fashion. You are in on it. But if we think everything in language is ostensive, or that there are explicit formulations that covers every use of a word, there is no need for an observer. Only ChatGPT or a clockwork in the universe. Whereas the third option, much more closer to what actually happens in a life situation, where there are relations, there are so many factors, uncountable, I would say. So with that little recap, we continue to look at the text. It is 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth paragraph on page 7, left column. And each of these cases shows a use of the expression "I now understand." Each corresponds to a circumstantial rule discussed earlier, which states that the expression can be correctly used under such and such circumstances. These grammatical rules are part of the grammar of expression. With the method of rule listing, Wittgenstein presents some grammatical rules concerning sudden understanding. After this, in PI 152, Wittgenstein invites us to look at the processes involved in these cases to see which process can be identified with understanding. He points out that none of the processes are sufficient for understanding. For instance, the mental occurrence of the formula does not guarantee that the person understands the series. But are the processes which I've described here understanding? B understands the system behind the series surely doesn't mean simply the formula AN occurs to B, for it is perfectly conceivable that the formula should occur to him and that he should nevertheless not understand. He understands must have more to it than the formula occurs to him. And equally, more than any of those more or less characteristic concomitant processes or manifestations of understanding. Here, Wittgenstein employs a method which I will call the method of sufficiency. With this method, he shows that no process which is manifested in understanding can be identified with it. So the investigation thus far has yielded the following result. Now we try to get hold of the mental process of understanding, which seems to be hidden behind those coarser and therefore more readily visible concomitant phenomena. But it doesn't work, or more correctly, it does not get as far as a real attempt. There's no process which can be identified with understanding. Understanding is not a mental process at all. Wittgenstein expresses this result in a paradox-like remark, which is quite typical of his style. In the sense in which there are processes, including mental processes, which are characteristic of understanding. Understanding is not a mental process. I will, with the permission of Kalle, also read one of the footnotes because it's very telling. And footnote 8 here. One might argue that in obtaining this result, Wittgenstein also employs the method of family resemblance and the method of necessity to show that there is no process which can be found in all cases of understanding. All, and that no process is necessary for understanding. I omit these two methods here, but see Lin 2019 for how Wittgenstein uses them to deal with the problem of thinking. understanding is not a mental process. What this remark means is roughly this. There are mental processes which typically go with understanding, but understanding is not a mental process. In order for us to see clearly the grammar concerning understanding, Wittgenstein also advises us to consider how we learn the expressions of understanding, writing. Think how we learn to use the expressions. Now I know how to go on. Now I can go on. And others. In what family of language games we learned their use? I will call this method the method of learning consideration. When we consider learning, we are likely to come up with situations in which the expression "I now understand" is used. And learned. Hence, the method of learning consideration is closely related to that of rule listing. The conclusion of the investigation conducted with all the methods I identified above is that understanding is not a mental process. This conclusion is clear, and anyone who went through the above grammatical investigation seriously and carefully would agree to it. It is then a thesis which Wittgenstein speaks about in PI 128. if someone were to advance thesis in philosophy, it would never be possible to debate them because everyone would agree to them. Indeed, the following puzzlement, no wonder, might still remain at this point. All right, understanding is not a mental process. But what is understanding then? When one understands, does nothing go on in his mind? Wittgenstein makes it clear that whatever goes on in one's mind is not understanding. When one understands, he may have things occurring in his mind, but he may have nothing going on in his mind. It is the context which determines whether one understands or not. For instance, in the context in which someone has learned algebra and has done derivation using formula before, the mental occurrence of a formula means that the person understands the series. If the person has not learned algebra before, then he does not understand the series even if he has the formula occurring in his mind. So the difference between understanding and non-understanding lies not in what goes on in the mind, but in what happened before. I think that by now I have shown that the problem of sudden understanding as a mental process can be successfully dissolved by Wittgenstein's grammatical investigation. I have done so by making clear the grammar and the methods Wittgenstein uses in conducting the investigation. In the next section, I will show that these methods are also employed in Wittgenstein's investigation of emotion, and that the grammar concerning emotion is similar to that concerning sudden understanding. Wittgenstein on emotion. Why is Wittgenstein interested in emotion? The answer must be that emotion generates some philosophical problems. To understand Wittgenstein's thought on emotion, we must first understand the relevant philosophical problems. The question, what is emotion, is one that philosophers often ask themselves, as well as more specific questions such as what is fear? What is joy? Misled by the form of the question, which is what is X? Philosophers think that an emotion must be a particular thing. Wittgenstein characterizes philosophers' thinking well. But I do have a real feeling of joy. Yes, when you are glad, you really are glad. But joy surely designates an inward thing. One wonders, what does I am afraid really mean? What do I aim at when I say it? But depression, anger, is surely a particular feeling. When enjoying reading a poem, I experience something different. But didn't you enjoy it during the reading? Is hope a description of a state of mind? And do not the words "I am afraid," no matter how they are uttered, give me information about the same state of affairs, namely his state of mind? We can see that in Wittgenstein's eyes. Philosophers cannot help but think that an emotion is a particular feeling or a particular state of mind. These are the philosophical problems which he aims to dissolve. In this paper, I will only focus on Wittgenstein's treatment of emotion as a particular feeling. The problem of emotion as a particular state of mind is big enough to deserve a full paper treatment. How does Wittgenstein deal with the idea that emotions is a particular feeling? I will first present Wittgenstein's conclusions and then show how he reaches them. The following are Wittgenstein's conclusions. Depression is not a bodily feeling. No, joy designates nothing at all, neither any inward nor any outward thing. We ask, what does "I am frightened" really mean? What am I referring to when I say it? And of course, we find no answer, or one that is inadequate. That there is a fear syndrome of sensations, thoughts, etc., does not mean that fear is a syndrome. These conclusions are similar to those about understanding we saw in section 3. The first conclusion matches the earlier one that understanding is not a mental process. In parallel with the second conclusion, Wittgenstein could say, understanding designates nothing at all, neither any inward nor any outward thing. The third conclusion is essentially the same as the remarks. Now we try to get hold of the mental process of understanding, which seems to be hidden behind those coarser and therefore more readily visible concomitant phenomena. But it doesn't work. Or more correctly, it does not get as far as a real attempt. The fourth conclusion, Zettel 502, is very much the same as PI 154. And it means that although fear may be associated with some symptoms, such as certain sensations and thoughts, fears not to be identified with any of these. We have just seen that Wittgenstein's investigations of understanding and of emotion have reached the same conclusion. That is, that a mental phenomenon, such as understanding or an emotion, is not an entity, a process, or a feeling. It is natural to ask whether Wittgenstein's methods of dealing with these two problems are also the same. We saw that in the case of understanding, Wittgenstein uses the methods of rule listing and of sufficiency. So does he also employ them in the current case of emotion? The answer is yes. This is quite clear in ppf 74 to 76. In 74, Wittgenstein lists a number of different uses of I am afraid. Then in 75, he says, no answer is forthcoming, or only an inadequate one. If we want to know what the utterance refers to, this combination of moves is the same as that in the case of understanding. After listing some circumstantial rules for I now understand in PI 151, Wittgenstein remarks in PI 153, but it doesn't work, or more correctly, it does not get as far as a real attempt. In the case of fear, Wittgenstein wants us to pay attention to the manifestations of fear, such as bodily feelings, thoughts, etc., which occur when we say, I am afraid, and see that none of these symptoms are sufficient for one's being in fear. Indeed, he explicitly suggests we do this, as he writes in paragraph 76. Try to find the thing, the fear, by repeating the expression of fear and at the same time attending to myself, as it were observing my mind out of the corner of my eye. So Wittgenstein here does employ the method of sufficiency to show that fear is not a thing either inward or outward. However, there's a difference between Wittgenstein's treatment of understanding and that of fear. In the former case, Wittgenstein himself presents some processes which may occur when someone understands. But in the latter case, he does not list the symptoms of emotion, or at least not here in PPF section 9. Rather, he asks the reader to perform this task. Seen in this light, Canfield's work is particularly useful. And there is a perfect stopping point. Useful. And Canfield I can sincerely recommend as well. Is a particularly good translator of Wittgenstein's thinking. Canfield. It's not a small thing here. That's why because of time, but also because it is a massive subject. It's much more important than one might think initially. If we make by mistake the idea that thinking is a process, there is no escaping we are computers. None at all. And there is no possibility, once the mistake is established, or overuse of the idea of think, rather, there is no fixing the problem. It all tries at fixing the problem after this would be like putting makeup on a wound. It would look better, but the undergoing infection, the cut, will remain. And of course, as I said before, this is the very kernel of Wittgensteinian thinking. To go to the before point. And speaking of before, let's go to some quotes. And we jump all the way back to the 7th page. And the last PI here is good. And this is: understanding is not a mental process. In some cases, it could look that way. It's very similar to that way, but so to speak, generalizing understanding to a mental process. And all of a sudden, you have the idea that we are calculating, or machines with legs and arms. Carefully, Wittgenstein leads us away from that misunderstanding, misconception, and saves us from the Putnamian brain in the vat. It saves us from the idea of the mind to be a complicated steam engine, which was already suggested in the late 18th century. We go to page 8, the very next page, on the left column at the bottom. Listen to this. Third line from the bottom. It is the context which determines whether one understands or not. There is no understanding like an estate in itself, a particular process of understanding disconnected from anything in the world, having nothing to do with you, and being, I'd say, almost always automatic in some way. No, it is the context, what you want with it, what it's leading to, and so many other things. For an explanation, go to the next column. If a person has not learned algebra before, then he does not understand the series, even if he has the formula occurring in his mind. So I can have, this is about the number series. I can have the continuation of the number series in my head. I can even pronounce them. And other people might think I understand. But if I have no previous experience of algebra, I have not understood. So you see, the past come in here. Your person, you as an observer, your priming, your knowledge, your prior, to speak in mathematics. We mentioned Bayesian statistics and mathematics. Your prior is what decides whether understanding is there. It is much more specific than the Putnamian brain in the vat, or and why not the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, where cogito seems to be a process that hangs in the sky and thinking is for everyone. Is not how the word think works, neither understand. It wouldn't have a place in the language game, and it doesn't participate. Go to the bottom of this column, the fourth subchapter, and that must be the 8th line. The question, I'll read the whole thing. The question, what is emotion, is one that philosophers often ask themselves, as well as more specific questions such as, what is fear? And what is joy? Misled by the form of the question, which is, what is X? Philosophers think that an emotion must be a particular thing. And I would say, not only philosophers, it's well established among all of us. It's a variety of explaining estain or ousia, or confusing being with beings. Just by posing the question, what is X? All of a sudden we make it to something it isn't. Have you stopped beating your wife? It's exactly the same type of question. It establishes things that are unwanted and do not follow a regular language game. No matter how you answer the question, have you stopped beating your wife? Something is established. Same goes for what is X. The chicken or the egg? Does it start with a question or is it a misunderstanding before? Hard to say. I think it comes simultaneously. There is no particular moment of understanding. You can, of course, say, Eureka, I do understand. But that is not the point here. The point is, it is not always a process. It can be so many different things, and that goes for emotion as well. Some emotions seem to have duration, others do not. For instance, hope. For how long have you been hoping? Doesn't really make sense. But how long have you been angered? Does make a certain sense. Once more, we are so helped by family resemblance to get us out of the bottomless pit of identity and sameness. Then page 9, at the bottom of the right column. We have just seen that Wittgenstein's investigations of understanding and of emotion have reached the same conclusion. You see, understanding and emotion, that is, that a mental phenomena such as understanding or an emotion is not an entity or a process or even a feeling. It leads us away from that horrible trap. Otherwise, the more we think, the more trapped we will be. It's like a sinkhole. If you walk into it, you will sink further, and the more you move, the more it will drag you down. This is an extraordinary important point, or points that are made by Wittgenstein. Yes, they are condensed in the article, heavily condensed, but it leads to the idea that we are computers, inevitably, if we don't handle this problem. It needs to be addressed. If it is addressed, it will lead to an enormous liberty of using it properly when it's apt. And I would say that that is the locus aminus. It leads to ataraxia, leads to enjoyment and satisfaction and a peace of mind. You do not have to ask the question, what is emotion, understanding, etc. Kalle, are you there? Can you join?
Yes. Let me go to this previous page. Perhaps this is a hint that we should also study Lean 2019A.
Yeah.
Because our family resemblance, I think, is a key to many problems in our society. Let us go to, let me see the next page. The first phrase there. We are now almost in October here in Sweden, everywhere.
Give me a high five.
But especially in Sweden,
Especially
we have a lot of depression.
you heard as well. I had a lot of people complaining, yeah?
Yes.
You don't suffer from it, I can see. Did you meet?
I don't like too much darkness either.
No, me neither.
Especially here in Sweden, it can be dark already 3:30 or 4 p.m.
Oh, don't even. I get the shivers just you mention it to me.
But let's reason about this phrase. So this is the first phrase here. But depression, anger. No, it was not. It's really a particular feeling. Let me see. Let me see. Depression. Yes, actually. Let me see. He actually mentions depression. For how many? 14 times. So he was also Wittgenstein. Yes, it actually mentions on this page twice. Desperation is not a bodily thing. So it's the second. So this was first. Depression, anger is surely a particular feeling. So here he says that is a feeling. Do you see?
Indeed.
Okay. And then here is not a bodily feeling.
No.
So let us reason. So what is what is a wrong question? So in Wittgenstein's understanding, things are depending on the context. There's the keyword context and practice. So things, and you can understand depression and many other things depending on the context. We had that phrase that you read earlier. It is the context which determines whether one understands or not.
Yes.
Yes. And then we can add also the practice in one way. So what is depression? So it would be the context. Say you are in Sweden, but perhaps if you're in Florida, it's not the same context. You would probably not get depressed there,
No.
at least not for some same reasons. And it can be also practice. Perhaps you have a healthy practice. You go out and practice, literally speaking, then you don't get depressed. What would you say, Hans?
I think it's an excellent question. Let me expand. Depression is not a bodily feeling. What I think he means here in the remarks of the philosophy of psychology is a bit like I mentioned before. What is depression? Like in a stain, usia. It doesn't mean, however, that there is no bodily things to depression. That can occur, and we know it often occurs, but it's not identical to a bodily feeling. It's family resemblance once more. We've seen people who are depressed, they are often slouched, like this. The eyes are gloomy and so forth. But the depression itself is not identical to that or the same. That is the point he's making. And very important, our counter question should not be, hello, Wittgenstein, what is then depression? It is not a question to be asked because the question from the beginning is wrong. Because it is similar to have you, as I mentioned, have you stopped beating your wife? No matter how you answer it, you will be stranded with what is to make depression into a thing, or a process, or an activity, and so on. And he gets very strong in the next. No, joy designates nothing at all, neither any inward nor any outward thing.
So what is then the context and practice? Context and practice.
Yeah, in the context. And he gives some hints when understanding can come. If I look at the number series, and maybe you are looking at me and I'm looking at the number series, and I utter the next number, you would be in the belief that I have understanding. And you say, Hans, you did understand that number series. But the fact is, I haven't studied algebra. There is no understanding, even though I am correct.
Can you give some other example algebra?
Well, you can take a painting, for instance, and I say something about a Cézanne painting, for instance. Well, he's using the colorations, which is so typical for that period in Cézanne. But the thing is, I am an observer, is not him. What do I mean by an observer? My previous knowledge. What have I previously in my life learned about Cézanne?
Mm.
It brings in the observer. It brings in the prior, brings in the priming, it brings in who you are. That's the observer. And many, many more things.
Indeed, yes, we should not only take in context practice, but also the observer's
Oh,
experience.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And which is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a lot.
So we could say, depression depends on context, practice, and observer's
Yeah,
experience.
definitely.
Now I would jump to something else if I can.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So this is the last thing. I think this is more this is fun. I think this phrase
Let's
here.
go ahead.
And let me see. By repeating the expression of fear, and at the same time attending to myself, as it were observing my mind out of the corner of
Yeah.
my eye. So this is almost similar to panopticon in let's say if you don't have access to a camera.
Yeah, yeah.
You can actually become a panoptic yourself in this phrase. Here is he's ironic. I don't think he's very serious here.
He's taking the role once more as we usually call it the interlocutor.
Yes, absolutely.
It's usually Frege, but it could be someone else.
So here, no, I was thinking about some funny thing.
Oh, but that was funny as well. But okay, go ahead.
Let me think. Um, um, 40. Right here. Let me see if I can find it. Now let me take actually. Yeah, we had it actually. Let's see.
Ah,
Do you remember
yeah, I
this
do. Yeah,
episode?
very good, Kalle. I do like it. At the corner of the eye. Yeah.
Let me, with the for the benefit of the viewers who are not familiar with this, Fawlty Towers Eye Hospital. We can perhaps dedicate 1 minute to this. Let me see. Hopefully this gives it. So he Fawlty Towers, Basil. He is. His head is. He got a blow in his head.
Yeah.
So supposedly be resting in the bed, but he doesn't want to stay in the bed.
Yeah. You're getting this. I think we need to stop there because of copyright.
Yes. So he goes back to the bed.
Eyes put to sleep.
He pretends to be sleeping so he can be alone.
At the corner of the eye.
Okay, perhaps we should stop there.
You should think about the possibility of copyright infringement. But very well, yeah, great. I think that was a very lucid chat we had here. I do like that. We could come back to that. I think it will help in the understanding of Wittgenstein. I think we'll end there, Kalle.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very
end it.
much, Kalle, for your marvelous questions, as usual, comments. Thank you very much for attending, everyone. Have a very pleasant morning, day, or afternoon. Bye-bye for now.